usually, at the end. And there's remember the Hand of the Baskervilles, which is extraordinarily amusing, because the hound is covered with phosphorus to make it glow in the dark. So when it races after some poor chap, he's looking back terrified on the sort of West Country moor, and yet phosphorus is so poisonous that the dog licks itself all the time, one lick and it's dead. But these stories are metaphorical, they're extreme exercises in the imagination. They're not concerned with these pettifogging details of which critics make too much. Now Murillo creeps into the garden, and horror of horrors, what does he find? He finds the dead body of the dog. And it looks as though it's been savagely mauled in a way by something he doesn't understand, by some weird thing, or ape, or monster. He then proceeds into the house and finds much of it wrecked. Nabonius is nowhere to be seen, and one of his servants, Joker, has been murdered. Suddenly, he gets into the inner chamber of Nabonius' villa, which is modelled on a Renaissance palace, essentially. And he sees the red priest, so named because he wears this red cowl, sitting on a throne made of sort of alabaster and this sort of thing, and everything's very heavy and ornamental. A bit like those Cecil B. DeMille films from the 30s, that sort of, everything's extraordinarily overdone and luxuriant, and he creeps up to Nabonius to stab him, and the figure turns, and it's a weird thing, or a monster of one's imagination. It's not human at all, simian rather than human, and Nabonius faints, and then the story closes. This story is in 3 acts, traditionally like a lot of Western drama, like Dante's Inferno, Paradise. You've got this three-pronged triadic element, partly the synthesis, the antithesis, the synthesis at the end. So that's the first part. The second part is Murillo awakens in dungeons or interconnected corridors underneath Nabonius' house, mansion. He crawls along a corridor and somebody hisses, and it's Conan who's come into the house to murder Nabonius because Murillo's going to pay him. And because he's, a sort of member of a cult that he dislikes and so on. Murillo senses hair like the young aristocrats of his era, and Conan's senses are so acute that he detects that with his nostrils, and that's the reason he doesn't attack him in the darkness. They both decide they swear loyalty to each other. Don't forget, this is an oral culture where bonds and legal sanctions are expressed orally. Howard despised the element of modern life where people say anything they want just to get their own way at any particular time. In pre-modern, say, Nordic societies, the oath or something which is given verbally with strength is as binding as any legal document ever could be, even more so. Conan and Murillo proceed looking for Nabonius. They come out into the body of the house, which, as I say, resembles this sort of Renaissance Florentine palace. And they see Nabonius stripped, semi-naked, and wounded in a neighbouring corridor. And they wonder what has replaced him up inside the house. And what has happened, as he, in a dazed way, explains once he returns to full consciousness, is that his servant, who's this ape that he's taken from one of the outlying countries in Howard's imaginary kingdoms, has supplanted him as the master in the house. Howard, to a moderate degree, believed in science, believed in evolution. It was very much almost a cult then, as was eugenics. And Tuck, as he's called, this ape man who wears the red because he supplanted the human that he wanted to supplant, has thrown his master, Nabonius, into the pits and has seized control of the house. Tuck sits waiting for them to come out of the pits because there's a bell underneath in the pits that they've crossed, a trap basically, and he knows humans are down there and he's waiting for them. Nationalists emerge. There's an interesting political element here because Nabonius is a very corrupt ruler and has the king in his thrall. So nationalists of the city-state. You could be a nationalist then of a city-state because it was the unit of civilization essentially, and a country would be city-states federated together. Attempts to assassinate Nabonius in the way that Murillo wanted to. Tack deals with them. The story fast forward in a very filmic way because Howard is a visualizer. The male brain is visual and always thinks in images. And these sorts of stories are extraordinarily cinematographical in their nature and their forward-pumping lucidity. Tack senses that they've come up from under the ground. And they're interesting pseudoscientific elements. The Red Priest Nabonius is a scientist and a mage and a magician combined. It's religion and the decline of magic in some ways, if viewed academically. He has this construction of mirrors whereby from one room you can reflect light through tubes that contain small mirrors, and it ends up being able to look into another room, so you can actually look round corners. And they can see Tack and he can see them. Because he needs to dispose of the bodies of the nationalists who've come into the house, Tack disappears for a time and Conan and the others seize their chance and they go up. Nabonius becomes terrified when all the doors are locked and he can't find the weapons they need to fight against his servant who's turned against him. In the end, Conan has to face off against Tack in this quite extraordinarily violent scene that Howard was one of the most brilliant writers of physical force and conflict between men in the 20th century. There's little doubt about that. It's so immediate, you're almost there, and it is essentially visual. Conan and Tack have this clash of the gods type of titanic duel with each other, much like a scene from Homer, basically, as Hector before the walls of Troy. Tack is gunned down in the end, and Conan, half dead, is saluted by Murillo. Nabonius then tries to betray both of them, and Conan does for him, really, with a stool. He whips up a stool and throws it at his head, and he falls. And all Conan can say is his blood is red, not black. Because in the slums of the city, they said the Red Priest's blood was black because his heart was black. And Conan's a barbarian and a literalist, you see. His blood isn't black. There's an interesting moment when Conan is helped by Murillo because he's so hurt and wounded in the fight with Tack. And he pushes Murillo aside and says, "A man walks alone. When you can't stand up, it's time to perish." That's not an attitude you heard from the Blair government too often, is it? These are pre-modern attitudes, you see. As somebody on Radio 4 would say now, but that's a dangerously exclusionist notion. What about the ill? What about the weak? And of course, in that type of barbaric morality, the strong look after the weak, but only in an ascent of being and natural law, which is codified on the basis of the morality of strength. That's what those sorts of civilizations thought and felt. And the other interesting thing is that he looks down on Tack, this sort of beast sort of man that he's killed, and he says, "I didn't kill a beast tonight, but a man. And my women will sing of him." And these are sort of, there's two attitudes towards, there's two cultural views of these sorts of things. One is to regard them as remarkable pieces of, creative imagination. The other is to sort of laugh and sneer at them and think that they represent old-fashioned values that we've thankfully gotten rid of or moved away from. The stories, with the exception of the Cain stories, are all pre-Christian in the most radical of terms, and yet pre-liberal and liberal secular, which of course in the modern West is what's replaced Christianity. I would say that contemporary Catholicism is rather like the Protestantism of yesteryear, and Protestantism has become liberalism. And liberalism has morphed, strangely, without the Protestantism that gave it a moral compass, into a form of cultural Marxism. And that's what we have now. And yet, Howard's stories are very, very interesting and very dynamic and very much appeal to an imaginative element in certainly a lot of men. The belief in self-definition, the belief in the heroic as a model for life, the belief in strength, but with an honour code that saves it from wanton exercise in strength without purpose, and that believes that one is part of even a tribe or a community. In the stories, Conan's a Cimmerian. He's from a northern group. He's always introduced, he's only got one name. He's so primal, he doesn't have any other names. Conan, like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, he only has one name. Heathcliff, you don't need any other names. He's just a force, you see. A force of the female imagination, which is what he is. And in a strange way, the way in which he's described in that novel by Emily Bronte is very similar to the way Conan's described, but a bit more beefed out, a bit more muscular. Many films have been made, many TV series have been made. There's a Conan industry in the 20th century. What Howard would have thought of all that, no one knows. He's there, possibly on a slightly lower tier, but with Tarzan and Doctor Who and James Bond and these other iconic sort of mass popular fantasy figures. Yet in all of them, certainly in this sort of